Let's get a sense before we start of what inspired a working class girl from Birkenhead to become one of our greatest ever actors. Glenda, let me start with I suppose, like a formative memory, taking yourself right back to childhood. Do you have an earliest memory of performing for a group of people?
Yes, I do, because by this time I'd left school and I was working in a local Boots, and I think I was probably bored very close to death. And a friend of mine was in a local amateur group, and she asked me to join, and I did. And then somebody else said to me, you should do this professionally. And I thought, well, so I wrote to the only drama school I'd ever heard of, which was RADA, and I had to do 2 auditions for them. And they wrote back and said if they'd had a scholarship, I would have got it, but they didn't have a scholarship, so I was there with no money at all. And the manager of the Boots that I worked with wrote to my local county, which was Cheshire in those days. I think it's Greater Liverpool now, I can't remember. And they funded me. Wow. For the 2 years that I went to RADA. So that's how it all started.
And that was 54, mid-50s, something like that, wasn't it?
Well, I'm 86 now, and I was 18 the year I went to, so you work out the maths.
Was there a sense when you arrived at RADA that social change was in the air, that there were people arriving at drama school getting opportunities that possibly wouldn't have had before? And you talk about the help that you had there from your local authority.
Oh, very much so. I mean, there was a new director of RADA, and he had an infinitely broader perspective of what constituted theatre and acting than the predecessor who'd been there for a very long time. And it was a real cross-section of populations, not exclusively of this country, but also foreign countries, yes, very much so.
Things were changing, there were opportunities, particularly for working class actors. I mean, it's just interesting to look back at what's happened over the decades since. Do you worry that things have slightly slipped back in terms of opportunity?
I never really noticed it going forward, but I'm... But I say that more as a female than as a working class female, I have to say. And we're still looking at a situation where contemporary dramatists find women boring. I mean, they are rarely, if ever, the central driving engine of what the writer has decided to explore. And I find that utterly bewildering. Well, I don't find it bewildering, I just bitch about it a lot.
Were you bitching about it at the time when you entered the profession? Was it something that you wanted to challenge and help overcome?
Not initially, no, because it was such a different kind of world that I was inhabiting from the one I'd known for 18 years. But you don't have to be long in the theatre to realise that the balance is simply not there, you know. And of course, the overriding desire when you first step into the theatre is to get work at all, and it's very hard when you don't.
So you didn't see it right from the beginning as a sort of a social purpose of being able to play a part in affecting some kind of social change with the art that you were making?
Not at all, because there were very few parts that would have taken that idea forward. You know, it was still very structured. I mean, not only the male dominance, but also the class structure. I mean, this country then is still very much in the virtually closed, you know, hands of what were the class structures and who were the goodies and who were the baddies and that kind of thing. Yeah.
And let's just talk briefly about your dear friend Peter Brook. Who has just very sadly died. And you had a breakthrough role, I think it was in 1966, in Marat Sade. Yeah. And you were playing Charlotte Corday, the assassin of the French radical Jean-Paul Marat, and directed both on screen and on stage, originally, by Peter Brook. Memories of working with Peter on that production in particular?
It was truly, I mean, I find it difficult to find the words to express what I felt the first time I actually worked with him, because it was so extraordinary to find someone who made the kinds of demands that he made, but in a way that didn't reduce you actually enlarged your capacity for imagination and argument. And he was just, well, he was a genius. I bet he's laughing up there now thinking, what are you going on about me for? Go away and do something. But he was just extraordinary.
In what way? What was his method? How would he direct you?
He always demanded the truth. And how you came to that, sometimes the process of finding that was fairly direct. Often it was very complicated because it was embedded in whatever the play was that was being done. But he was always open to what, before I'd worked with him, people would have thought you were crazy to go down that road. But he would encourage that, but also he would discourage it. His involvement with the work that a company was doing in a play was to be part of that company. He was never dictatorial. He could be, but he never was much. He was as open and in some extraordinary way, without being didactic about it very much, you suddenly found that you were thinking in a different direction. You know, there was another layer of imagination that you'd never touched before, and suddenly there it was, and you'd give it a go because of him. And if he liked it, he'd say, yeah, okay, go down there. And if he didn't, he'd say, oh, you're going down the wrong road. No, no, you know, it was one of his favourite words. Oh, no, oh, no.
What did you learn from him, do you think, as an actor? What did you take away from him? Or how did he change the way that you presented yourself on stage?
Oh, I don't know that he changed the way I presented myself, because I didn't have any idea of how to present myself. I mean, the part was all.
Right.
You know, and that was dictated by the actual play that you were doing, 9 times out of 10, if you were lucky enough to be employed. But he introduced different views about the theatre, and writers who had different views about the theatre as well, and this capacity for knowing there was something but not being absolutely clear what that something was, and expecting everybody to explore it. And there was an equality in that was really remarkable. I mean, because up until that point, if you had the kind of parts that I had, you knew pretty well what you were supposed to say and what you were supposed to do. With him, it was an open field, you know, and everyone had a right to explore it.
We'll probably primarily be talking about film and theatre over the course of this conversation. But the first clips we're about to see are both early television roles for Glenda. In a moment, we're going to see you as the Queen in Elizabeth R. From 1971, one of the 2 royal roles playing Elizabeth within that's the same year, I think, actually, and we'll come to Mary Queen of Scots in a moment. But first we're going to see a scene from the Wednesday play, a single play from 1965. It's Horror of Darkness.
Oh, right.
And Nicole Williamson was in it as well. Just before we see a clip, what do you remember of this production, if at all?
I remember that Nicole, who I'd first worked with in Glasgow, a rep, many years before, in the middle of rehearsals, suddenly disappeared for 2 days. And nobody knew where he'd gone, where he was, whether he was alive, whether he was dead, all that kind of thing. He came back after 2 days, smiles all over his face, as though nothing at all had happened, which was one aspect of his personality that was sometimes charming, but 9 times out of 10, absolutely ghastly. The thing I remember, I don't remember the early television particularly. What I do remember about television at that period of time, it's, I'm sure, different now, of working for cameras that didn't really seem to be very interested in you. I mean, one of the remarkable things about film, even though the cameras have changed quite dramatically, but whenever you stood in front of a film camera, you knew it was absolutely obsessed with you. You know, it was just looking at you. And television in those days, no. I mean, the machine was, well, that was just probably me, was just as happy watching football as it was watching you, you know, tear your heart out or have a breakdown or do something dramatic. Not to say football isn't dramatic. I acknowledge that it is.
So just to set the scene, Horror of Darkness is about a London couple whose life is kind of disrupted, upended by the arrival of an old friend carrying secrets, and the friend, played by Nicole Williamson, is gay. That emerges in the drama. Let's see a clip, first of all, from Horror of Darkness. We should be able to just magic it up on the screen.
Oh, right. Oh, up there.
Well, how did you find that? No, well, it's not everyone can fancy it. Still, if you give it a chance, you might surprise yourself. Come on.
Not.
What's the matter? You push for time.
I'm sorry.
You want him. You want to take him away from me. All right, try. I feel sorry for you.
I don't want to talk to you.
So do not talk to me of peace and God's good grace. Dying is a fearful process. I have known death since I was a child. I have stared long into his white, unseeing eyes. I know his dread cruelty. When you are lying on your last bed, remember my words. Cry out for mercy. Bite deep into your lips. And recall how you plotted my cousin's most terrible end.
When did you last see those, Glenda?
When were they made?
71, and previous
time
one,
ago.
Horror of Darkness, 65. So you wouldn't have seen them?
I haven't seen them since they were made. I
Really?
mean, yeah, I mean, I watched them, I think. I've got a feeling they would regularly show the episode for that particular cast and all the technicians. And I'm sure I saw it when it was on the... I'm not sure. I don't know whether we had a telly in those days. Anyway, yeah, a long time ago.
Wow. So what was that like, watching yourself? And it's just the Horror of Darkness, first of all. Incredibly powerful performance there. I mean, what a screen presence right from the start. And that's one of the first times that people would have seen you, I guess.
I must be honest, I remember Nicole. I don't remember doing the film at all.
Really?
And, I mean, I've seen bits of Elizabeth, you know, post, actually, but I haven't seen any of the episodes completely. But what I found interesting about Elizabeth was people I knew, people I didn't know, sent me all these books about her. And one of the most interesting books was by one of her ladies-in-waiting towards the end of her life. And she wrote, and I'm obviously paraphrasing the actual words, but when she was dying, she wouldn't go to bed. In many instances, she wouldn't even sit down, so all the ladies-in-waiting had to stand around, you know, and fall over and all that kind of stuff. But there was one thing where this particular evening, her lady-in-waiting said that she did actually sit down, and she went to sleep by sucking her thumb. And I thought that was so remarkable, you know, that this woman who had seen the ups and downs at the most extreme levels throughout her whole life, and for those she cared about. And she reverted, perhaps we all do, when death was approaching, to actually sucking her thumb, to being a child.
That's a wonderful detail, isn't it?
Yeah,
I suppose
I
for an
thought so.
actor, that's the sort of thing you want to latch
Absolutely.
onto, just to get a sense of...
Yeah.
It's the surprise in the character. But before you took on the role, what was the appeal of Elizabeth? Other than it's a fantastic role, but I mean, what did you want to explore within that character?
Well, it was the opportunity to do that kind of, to be with the character over that period of time, to go
6
from...
parts, was it?
Yeah, I think it was 6. You know, being sort of 16, 17 to in her 70s when she died. And being, as she was already, this sort of almost mythical character within this country's history and other countries as well. And it was a marvellous opportunity. I mean, the actors that were in it, you know, it was just amazing. And one worked with the same actors over such a long period of time, which again in itself was unusual. You know, you do one show and you don't see the actors again for years. And here we were for months working together. It was amazing.
It was landmark television, I think, at the time, wasn't it? It was quite an event. And I think you won an Emmy and a BAFTA for that performance. Did you sense at the time that everything was changing very quickly for you?
Not really, no. Not least because whenever I drove to the BBC, you know, as it was, it isn't there anymore now, nobody would allow me to park my car. So that was, you know, one of the kind of additional burdens you had to get over or deal with. Yeah. But no, it was an extraordinary opportunity, and there were so many things that were real that were part and parcel of that story. I mean, real documents, real letters, real incidents, and trying to make that character who had become mythical during her own life realistic in the time we were in was just fascinating. It was really very interesting to do.
Well, you become Elizabeth for a generation of viewers, don't you? There's a
I don't think so. I mean, there have been loads of Elizabeth since then.
But at the time, though, I mean, there must have been a sense
possibly at the time there was.
There's a kind of responsibility to her, isn't there, and the memory and the history of that time.
Well, I think there was a sense of responsibility by everybody engaged in it, you know. I mean, it is such an integral part of British history. Now, you could argue all night whether the history is accurate or not, particularly with regard to her. But it was an amazing thing to be part of, yes.
Let's turn to the film career, which starts with an absolutely astonishing run of success. We're about to see a series of clips, I think they're all 3 of them together, from Women in Love from 1969, for which you won your first Oscar, Sunday Bloody Sunday, a John Schlesinger film, also 1971. I think you got an Oscar nomination for that film, and also the same year reprising the role of Elizabeth in Mary, Queen of Scots. So 69, Women in Love, 71, 71. Let's just, in fact, before we talk, let's just see this package of astonishing clips.
Why do you keep repeating it, that there was never any love?
You don't think you love, do you?
No.
You don't think you can love me, do you?
I don't know what you mean by the word love.
Oh, yes, you do. You know very well that you have never loved me. Or have you, do you think?
No.
And you never will love me, will you?
Why do you torture me?
Oh, I don't want to torture you. Just say you love me. Say you will love me forever. Won't you? Won't you say it? Won't you say you will love me always, even if you don't mean it, but say it, Gerald, do.
Oh, I will love you always.
Fancy you're actually having said it. I'm not angry with you. I bought it because I love you. I bought your terms, and they were rotten terms, and I shouldn't have done it. My fault.
You keep asking too much.
For God's sake! Caring a lot about someone, is that too much? People who have some time for each other, is that too much? I've had this business. Anything is better than nothing. There are times when nothing has to be better than anything. If you look back on this, which you won't, you'll think it has something to do with Daniel. Well, it hasn't. New York for you, wouldn't you know?
For it is clear to me that Elizabeth, the bastard, the heretic, the usurper, is cursed by God, and will soon be too old to bear a child, and will die a solitary old woman. Above all, it is clear that Elizabeth fears Mary. And whatever my fate, my son will rule here in time.
You have noted all the blows I struck against you. All save one. It was I who sent Henry Lord Darnley to your court, sweet cousin.
Darnley?
Any queen who could be gulled by such a pretty, wicked fellow and take him to her bed and put a crown upon his head does not inspire fear. She inspires pity. You have my pity, madam, as you had it on the day I sent Darnley north, knowing you to be without wisdom, discretion, or any of the attributes of a queen. I see you have learned nothing since. It is not surprising that you are spoken of in the courts of Europe as an infamous royal whore.
Madam!
My lord, I urge you to guard your mistress well, for there are many who would wish her dead.
Now I have no choice. I must keep her prisoner until the day of her death.
Women in Love, Sunday Bloody Sunday, and Mary Queen of Scots. I've got to just mention, actually, I think that the BFI are re-releasing Mary Queen of Scots on Blu-ray. That's coming up. And, of course, Sunday Bloody Sunday is being shown here at 8:40. That's the one, I think, Sunday Bloody Sunday, you asked them to show that one.
That was one of the possible choices,
The possible choices, yeah.
We agreed in the right direction.
Let's talk about that in a moment, because we've just seen you on screen again as Elizabeth. Did you play her in a different way? And I presume that was shot after the television series, was it?
Yes, it was.
Did you approach the role, the character, or was it already hardwired in? Did it feel like you'd done the homework?
Well, it was an imaginary meeting. They'd never actually met, those two women, so that there was that definition that it was a story.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't a series of facts. And they were absolute figures, I mean, and kind of absolute opposition and that kind of thing. But it was great to work with Vanessa. I mean, she has the worst eyesight in the world. And that scene in particular, you know, where she's so, I mean, she's just a marvellous actress. And I knew she couldn't see me. She couldn't see me. And you know, it did make a scrap of difference to her performance level, but it was just, I was like this a bit the first time it happened, but she was marvellous.
Was that the first time you'd worked together?
Yeah.
And you've worked
first
together?
and only
First
time.
and only time?
Yeah. It just underlines the fact, you know, that women, as far as dramatists are concerned, don't have any place in the theatre.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
But that's interesting, is it? Because you talked about Elizabeth R as having, there's a sort of historical responsibility because you're sort of inhabiting the character, going back through the documents. There's a sense of veracity in the story, whereas this is drama. This is imagination.
Yeah.
Did it mean you had more of you could be freer with the character? There was more sense of liberation as an actor?
Well, I think the definitions were very clearly drawn. I mean, Elizabeth was the baddie and Mary was the heroine, you know, and so there was that kind of imbalance. But yes, I mean, it was quite fun to do. It was wonderful to work with Vanessa, even though she couldn't see you.
Sunday Bloody Sunday, that's the clip that we saw in the middle. And why did you say that's one that you would have agreed to have been shown tonight? Is it one that you're particularly proud of?
Well, I think it was very much first of its kind, and I mean, you know, Schlesinger was a terrific director, and it was a terrific cast. And the story itself, which on the surface seems to be pretty banal and, you know, 8 times out of 10, but there were subtleties in it that John was very keen to be able to dig out. I mean, I never watched the rushes, I never did, and I never would, but there would be a meeting on the day that you were shooting, and if you were in those scenes, you know, we'd all be there, and he'd come onto this set, and he'd say, "I've just seen the rushes. It's awful. I mean, why are we doing this? What are we thinking of? I mean, it's just ghastly. I mean, I don't know what we're going to do about this." And And the first time it happened, I thought, my God, I've got the sack. You know, I mean, this is not going to go anywhere. And this would go on without exception every day. And he would go through this, you know, whole language almost of distress, concern, it wasn't right, it was all wrong, what are we going to do? And then he'd suddenly say, but mind you, there are bits in it, perhaps it's not that bad after all. Okay, come on, let's do it. You know, and you'd be there working. And it was such a wonderful, he was a really fascinating director.
What does that do for morale on set? Because an actor's ego.
Well, it built it if it came from him. If it came from anybody else, of course, you'd go away and have a good cry. But no, with him, you knew that was his way of getting into the... Yeah. And the people who had worked with him before, and he did use the same people, you know, the same technicians and people like that in the films that he did, had heard all this before, so it came as no surprise to them. So they just sort of went, okay, you go through this. Yeah, and then we've got to work.
Yeah, it's a really tough... groundbreaking film, I guess, in a way. It's interesting that we saw a clip earlier from Horror of Darkness, because strangely some of the themes of that play prefigure what's played out in Sunday Bloody Sunday, because you have a sort of a three-way relationship. You have the two men and a woman, and there's a homosexual aspect to it, and all of those interweaving tensions being played out. Is that something that you were aware of when you did Sunday Bloody Sunday? Is that just a coincidence?
Well, it's hard to say whether it was just a coincidence, because the society at that time of Sunday Bloody Sunday was changing quite dramatically. And it may have been presented in its most... I don't mean the film, I mean the society we were creating, living in, may have been presented to us, and we might indeed have experienced ourselves on its extremities. But there was still a bulk of normal life, if you want to call it that, normal life. And these extraordinary things were happening in our society, but they were by no means across the whole of society. And that is one of the things about Sunday Bloody Sunday that I think is quite remarkable, because it's more than just the relationships. It has a much wider perspective than that, and he was so subtle in the way he introduced that and, you know, developed it. I mean, he was really terrific.
The psychological undercurrents of the film are really quite extraordinary,
Aren't they?
I think, particularly. Yeah. As you say, it's a film in which not a lot happens in terms of kind of whiz-bang, but there's
a hell of a lot is happening.
Really, yeah really. Yeah. It was interesting. I watched it the other day, and it was pointed out in a review I read from a long time ago that Daniel Day-Lewis makes his film debut.
Yeah, he was 12. He came to see me. I was doing a play in New York, and it was, I think, fairly soon after he'd announced he wasn't going to do acting anymore. And he came in, and I said to him, I haven't seen you since you were 12. And it was absolutely true. I mean, yes, and all he had to do, I think, was scratch a car with a key, you know.
He's a yob.
And, and as always, he did it beautifully, I think.
No, absolutely. Let's talk about some of the great directors that you work with. I'm going to talk specifically about Ken Russell in a minute, but I mean, you talk about Schlesinger there, but I mean, you know, Joseph Losey, Anthony Page, I mean, Trevor Nunn as well.
Absolutely.
What is the most important aspect that you're looking for when you're forging a relationship with a director? What are you looking for? Is it possible to simplify it? What are you looking for from a director?
Well, it's very hard to answer that, but essentially what you want is someone who doesn't tell you what to do, but helps you to find what you have to do. And Ken was great at that. I mean, he waited to see what you were going to do, don't misunderstand me, and he'd made clear what the scene was about. Well, we all knew what the scenes were about, but he would want to be surprised, and in a way, he could create an atmosphere where you would go in a direction that at first sight you might not think was going to work, but he would encourage that. So he was terrific. He was vile to everybody on the technical side, and the way he treated his wife was abysmal. I mean, he just would tear at her for no good reason, but she'd obviously had this every time she'd worked with him, so she just sort of was calm about it all. But he could be very, very difficult. But certainly on that film, he wasn't difficult as far as I was concerned.
Because, I mean, it was Women in Love, Music Lovers, the Rainbow. I mean, you made several films with him, didn't you?
Yeah, yeah.
And what was it, you're talking about Schlesinger and that sort of attitude of, like, it's not good enough, it's all going wrong, but actually knowing that you're going to get a better performance.
Yeah.
Was there a way that Ken Russell would be on set?
He would listen to anybody. If he was stuck for an idea, we'd all be on the set, and it wasn't going the way he wanted it to go. And the scene I'm talking about, not the film. And he would listen to anybody's idea.
Oh, wow.
Anybody at all. And if somebody said something that, flicked something in his brain, he would go with it. And, in that level, he was very, very open to acknowledging his own lacks in many ways and picking up on other people's ideas without making a big deal about it. Do you know what I mean?
That's really interesting to hear.
Not claiming it for his own,
right,
but actually dedicated to the work that was in progress.
That sounds quite a generous attitude on set, because you would expect somebody like Ken Russell, thought of as such a maverick, idiosyncratic director, you would expect something possibly to be somebody like him to be a bit more dictatorial, prescriptive. I want this. But what you're saying is he was open to...
Oh, he could be dictatorial, but essentially on practical things, lighting. And I remember we had eternities in that film. Well, it seemed like eternities at the time, of me working with a herd of cows. I mean, those cows with those big horns, I don't know what you call them. And that was... We seemed to be doing that forever, but that was because the animals weren't doing what he wanted rather more than the actors. Yes.
It looks terrifying, that scene, in fact. I mean, I was wondering whether there was some trickery involved, because you are walking towards a huge herd of cows, and that herd of cows could have just trampled you at any moment.
I shared all those thoughts. And made it abundantly clear to the man whose herd of cows it was what I thought. And he was very sanguine. Oh, no, he said, they would never harm you. I thought, you're a liar. Take my life into my hands doing this, but you do what you have to do.
I know you're very fond of Ken Russell, and having
yes.
made so many films with him. Do you think he's, looking back at what he made and the way that he's received and now regarded, do you think he's underrated?
Utterly underrated. I think it's absolutely appalling the way that he's been dismissed almost from... Because he transformed an aspect of British cinema which hadn't been there. I mean, how can you transform something? But you know what I mean? He brought to English, British cinema a kind of energy, a perspective, an imagination that we hadn't seen before. And I just think it's disgraceful the way he's been neglected. And, towards the end of his life, he was just simply dismissed as not being of any value at all. When you think of the quality of the films that he made when he was at his height, it's just scandalous, I think.
Why do you think that was the case?
I think he may have said too much, done too much to the wrong people at the wrong time. And certainly cinema had changed dramatically from what he had introduced. And so his approach to the work, I think, in some instances, it had been too extreme for people. And they found it easier to dismiss him than actually try to incorporate the work that he could do. And so towards the end, he didn't have any work that was valid or valuable. But all that energy was there. It couldn't be stifled, and it's just a shame that it wasn't utilised.
There is a kind of a hyper-real aspect, isn't there, to a lot of his films? Or maybe it is that sense of unrelenting energy.
I don't know whether it's hyper-realism, but I think you've put your finger on it. It's that energy which can go in a myriad of directions. And let's be honest, sometimes he went in every direction and it didn't work, but nonetheless, when it did, it was great.
Well, it worked with Women in Love for you.
Oh, yeah.
It was the first of your Oscar wins. That must have felt like a game changer for you. I mean, that must have felt like anything was possible now when you won that Oscar. Did it?
No. No, I mean, I'm not saying this just because, but...
I sort of thought you were going to say that.
Everything I've ever done with acting, and I think it's part of the actual process of getting work, actually. The minute a film, a play, a telly series, whatever finishes, I am convinced I will never ever work again. And that's I can hear some rumbles of laughter out there, but that's a really very frightening prospect. And it doesn't go away. And that is linked to how my career began. And to go back to what we were talking about earlier, women still not being regarded, and I point this out by contemporary dramatists as being a central dramatic engine. We're always, something on the sidelines.
Even though you drove that film, I mean, people talk about women in love and go, naked wrestling, but actually you are the heartbeat of that film, really, in many ways, aren't you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't just mean me. I mean me and my sister in it. I mean, the story itself is about that family, but it's this thing, it's just probably such, I sometimes think I think that as a kind of lucky charm, do you know what I mean? If I'm so convinced I'll never work again, someone will take pity on me and employ me. But
that's not just about being a woman and the scarcity of roles for women as you saw it. Is there something psychologically within you? Is there a sense of insecurity of whether you will act again? And where do you trace that back to?
Oh, I think it's part and parcel of the whole kind of structure of theatre and of acting in general, which goes back to the point that I made at the beginning, I've now made for the third time. Women are not regarded as being essential or primary movers or something that can actually change things for the better in those particular areas. I mean, there have been tiny little stumbly steps, and we are beginning to see more women's work. I mean, the women writers' work being done. But overall, there is still this belief that we are mere adjuncts, that we are not drivers of things. And I find that utterly bizarre, particularly after Thatcher. You know what I mean? It's just, yeah.
Even when you see, I mean, it's not in terms of roles for women, but really the most important thing is stories being written by women, isn't it? And when you see plays by whoever it is, Laura Wade or Lucy Prebble or...
But you've just made the point, you see. I mean, you say that, but the added underlining is it's written by a woman. Isn't it amazing? A woman can do this. Or it's directed by a woman. Thank you. It's directed by a woman. And that's the thing that is still standing in the way of all those talented females' work. They don't say that about men, do they? Who are they? I'm not quite sure, but I won't voice an opinion at the moment. But, yeah.
So you won an Oscar, and it still didn't make you think, I've made it. You didn't. I don't think you turned up for either of your Oscar.
No, I was working on both occasions.
Yeah. Oh, so it wasn't
It wasn't. I'm not going to. No, nothing like that. No.
But those early roles that we've talked about, there's some very serious stuff there. Some tough films, serious subjects. Did the success that was the films that were being rewarded and the plays and all the performances, did you feel that you were being seen as a certain type of actor at
yes,
at
very
that time?
much so, yeah.
Did it feel like you were being stereotyped in a way?
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
really?
And I was. I mean, all actresses are, depending on what is their first thing, that brings them into a broader public attention. Yeah, I mean, I was usually deemed to be insane or suffering from mental illness or something like that, you know what I mean? And it wasn't until, I think it was a touch of class that people then thought, oh, she can make people laugh, we'll have a go at that.
Or Morecambe and Wise before then.
Well, we're talking about film, they're quite separate.
I know, but I mean, that's a mainstream audience. Is that you must have jumped to that opportunity.
Oh, what? To work with those two any day of the week, any hour of the night, yeah, great.
Did you love it?
I did, yeah.
And what's your memory of making it? Because you were Cleopatra,
the most telling notice I've ever received in my life was Eric said to me, "Don't laugh and speak up." That was it.
You did. I've watched it. There is a slight giggle at one point. You couldn't help it.
Slight? My God. I mean, yeah, how anybody could keep a straight face working with them, but he was absolutely, they were both adamant about it.
You mentioned Touch of Class a moment ago, and let's move on to that, because this is a romantic comedy, and you and George Segal are playing a sort of a couple having an on-off affair. Will they? Won't they? I mean, it's pure romantic comedy, isn't it? That must have been really enjoyable to sort of flex a different set of acting muscles in a way.
Oh, it was extraordinary because, I'd been very lucky in the films that I'd done before that, but all made in this country, of course. And George Segal, brought to the, to the studio this incredible American film energy. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen in my life before. And it was entirely, what's the word I'm looking for? He created it, but it was real. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't phony, smiling at this or doing that. It was just this extraordinary energy. That what we were doing was life or death. And I hadn't come across that here, I tell you. And that was just amazing. Yeah.
Let's remind people of A Touch of Class. We're going to see a clip from this film now.
Would you like that light on or off?
Whichever you prefer.
How about on?
Certainly.
Would you do me a very big favor?
I thought that's what I was doing.
Would you mind getting on the other side?
What's wrong with this side?
Nothing. It's more natural for me being on that side.
Well, I don't want to make an international incident out of this, but it's more natural for me this side. We always started this way.
We?
Me and my Italian. You see, he had this tennis elbow and a bad shoulder, and... Well, anyway, I just got used to this side.
It doesn't work for me.
Why not?
I'm deaf in my left ear.
What's that got to do with it?
I won't be able to hear you.
I'm not going to say very much.
You're going to breathe, aren't you, sometimes? That sounds pretty good. Who knows? A word of encouragement may slip out at the right moment. It could do wonders.
Shall I walk round?
What?
Shall I walk around?
Oh, well, why don't you just slip over and I'll slide under?
Oh, no, I think it's better if I slip under and you slide over.
I'll tell you what we'd do. Why don't we just kind of roll towards each other?
It's getting awfully late. Why don't you just get on top and hope for the best?
Well, I've heard it put more romantically.
Indeed.
Christ, you're beautiful.
Glenda's grandson is here tonight, I should just point out. I'm feeling for him at that moment. You feel there's a sense of liberation there from, in terms of what you've been expected, the roles that you've been playing.
Absolutely.
You seem to be absolutely relishing every moment on screen.
Absolutely.
You love making it. And did the roles that you got offered after that, and having won another Oscar, of course, for Touch of Class, did the sort of offers change?
They were much more mixed than just one line, be it heavy murderous drama or comedy. There was a greater variety in what came along.
Let's also explore the interplay between theatre and film and television, because there's all sorts of pieces which are being shown as part of this BFI series. I think they've dug up Hedda, which is really a great shame, because I think the film has actually degraded, and it's going to be shown with a pink hue all the way through it. It's a real shame. Strange Interlude, Stevie, House of Benalda, Alba, all of which began as theatrical productions before being filmed. So that's something you did quite a lot at this time, isn't it? You sort of worked up the character, you were on the stage, and then you shot a different version.
Well, yes, but I don't think I was the only person responsible for what had been done in a theatre being made into a film. It was the potency of the theatrical production that had activated that. And it was very interesting to do in that level, because there are degrees of variation in film that you wouldn't use in the theatre and vice versa, really. So that was interesting as well.
But balancing between the mediums, I mean, between theatre and film and television.
One had no sense of bouncing. I mean, because they are very, well, they were then, I mean, very precise and conscious of themselves. But they are different when it comes to the point of view of acting, because if you're looking, a camera is absolutely obsessed with what you do. Audiences are less committed. So that, there are variations in your performance, and there may well be changes, not so much in changing the dialogue, but excising scenes that you may need to see 3 times in a theatre, but you only need to see it once on a screen.
And playing a character like Nina Leeds in Strange Interlude, the Eugene O'Neill, or in The Lorca, in the House of Bernarda Alba, playing Bernarda, both of those women very strong but kind of deeply flawed characters. How much are the flaws part of an appeal when you're considering a character?
I don't know that it's necessarily flaws as such, because there are other things that can be as potent which are not flaws. I think the element that is always there when they're great writers is a truth, not necessarily the truth, but a truth, a reality, something that is recognisable because it is so human, and I think that's part and parcel of both those.
And say at this time in the 70s, when you're being offered a lot of theatre pieces, what is the primary motivation for taking a role, the thing that's going to sway you? Is it the script? Does it have to be a great script?
Yeah. And well, say great, I mean, it is a way to undermine what can be theatrical in that sense. But yes, and something that's not that you can relate to, but that you believe in relating to others, I think. Yes. Yeah.
We've got a clip from Strange Interlude, in fact, I think now,
right.
from the Eugene O'Neill. Let's just let's see that.
Listen, Ned. From things she wrote me just before she died, I'm absolutely sure Sam's mother must have been lying about the insanity that time.
No, she told you the truth. I never mentioned it, but I went up there once and made a thorough investigation of his family. I loved you horribly at that time, Nina. Horribly.
If you don't love me now, Ned, I must make him love me again, enough to make him tell Sam.
She'd like to own me. I wish she wouldn't touch me. What is this old tie of happiness between our flesh? I won't meddle with human lives again, I tell you.
And I loved you horribly. I still love you, Ned. I used to hope he would go insane. I loved you so much. But look at Sam. He's as sane as a pig. There's absolutely no danger now.
What is she after? What does she want me for? I'm no longer a doctor, but I'd say Sam's a healthy miss of nature's. It's 1,000 to 1 against it at this late day.
Then isn't it time we told him the truth? Think how he made us suffer. We've made him rich and happy. Isn't it time he gave us back our son?
So that's it. Tell Sam the truth, at last. God, I'd like to tell him at that. Our son? You mean yours, my dear. You kind of count me out of any further meddling.
Sam won't believe me. He'll think I'm lying out of spite because of my crazy jealousy. You've got to tell him too, Ned.
I'd like to see his face when I tell him that his famous oarsman son isn't his son, but mine. That might pay me back a little for all he's taken from me. I won't meddle in Sam's life again, I'm telling you.
Think how he made us suffer. We've made him rich and happy. You were the only happiness I've ever known in life.
Oh, she lies. It was always her other lover, Gordon. He was always there first, then her son, Gordon.
Oh, if only I'd gone away with you that time when you came back from Europe. Think how happy we would have been, dear. Think how our son would have loved you if it hadn't been for Sam.
Yes, if it hadn't been for Sam, I would have been happy. My boy would have loved me, and I'd have loved him.
You've got to tell him, Ned. For my sake. Because I still love you. Because you remember our afternoons, our mad happiness. Because you love me.
Yes.
Remember any of that,
You don't remember any of that? It's a really interesting piece, isn't it? Eugene O'Neill wrote it in the mid-20s, and that, I think, is 1988. And there's an interesting device within that piece in which the characters are alternating almost seamlessly between what they're saying to each other, what they're saying out loud, and then articulating inner thoughts as well.
Right.
But,
no, it's a great play.
Yeah, but you don't
I don't remember any of that.
Do you remember it on stage at all? Do you remember, I mean, what was that like to play when you're having to kind of bounce between those two modes of expression?
Oh, well, I mean, the play had finished. I mean, so the film was quite... I mean, it was a new experience for doing it for the camera, but it was extraordinary to do. I mean, that play ran for 5 hours.
Wow.
And it played to packed houses every single night. And that, of course, is the author. I mean, it's a great, great play. And it was a great thing to do because the cast of both occasions were terrific, you know, and it was something wonderful to do. And it hadn't been done in donkey's years. And in some ways, I could understand that, but we were very lucky to be able to do it.
So that was 88. Your political career started, of course, when you were elected in 1992.
Yeah.
Years ago, you told me that the reason that you decided to go into politics was hearing Margaret Thatcher say there is no such thing as society, famously, and you walked into a glass window.
Yeah.
In a state of rage.
Fury. Yeah. Mind you, it was my glass window, so nobody else needed to bother. But yeah.
What happened? You heard that on the radio and you just...
Yes, it was one of those, you know, Margaret telling us how to live. And it was my window. I mean, it was in my house, so yeah. But that wasn't the only reason I went into it. I mean, I obviously was a Labour Party supporter, and indeed still am. And I did work for the party, but when I actually, you know, I was approached, must have been about 2 years before I actually said yes to putting myself forward as a potential member of Parliament. Yeah, and never thought I'd get it, I have to say, but there we are. I was there for 20-odd years.
Were you disillusioned with film and television? And, I guess not theatre at that time. But
no, I wasn't disillusioned, but it was, I mean, you know, this country was being changed radically, and in my view, drastically, politically, and I'd always been interested in politics and done things, you know, for the Labour Party, and there I was suddenly going there.
Well, there you were in the House of Commons performing. How much did you draw on that experience, particularly of your stage work?
It's the least performing place I've ever been in, actually, because the overwhelming thing that is always there with you is that you are there because, pardon me, other people have sent you there, and those other people's lives and other people's situations are not only omnipresent, but omniscient, and they are why you're there, and they are what you're there for.
What about that moment after the death of Thatcher, when you took to the floor of the Commons and you were very, very forthright, and you were heckled from the Tory benches, and yeah, I mean, inevitably, of course. But did you plan that speech? Was it written or was it improvised? What do you remember of that day?
Well, I remember saying to the Speaker, could I be called at a certain point in the afternoon because I had something to do in the constituency? And he very kindly called me because there were lots of people who wanted to speak. And I just spoke what I thought and felt. I mean, that was the world that I knew under her regime. Those allusions to what constituents were enduring at that time were accurate and true. I didn't expect it to be, you know, some kind of major thing, but it was a major thing for me because I can remember my sense of disbelief at the changes that were taking place in our country when she was in number 10. Pretty much to what I'm feeling now.
And there was a fantastic final line, I think it was possibly a final line in that speech when you said, a woman, maybe, but not on my terms.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, just...
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I mean, it sounds so hypocritical to say it, but I mean, I saw those brief bits of film when she was going through her, was it dementia? I think it was her final illness, wasn't it? And I felt Well, I hope if everyone would feel sympathy for her, but it didn't change my opinion of her as a member of Parliament, as a Prime Minister. I still think she did more harm than good.
And what about your own your biggest achievements within politics, looking back at what you did? What would you say?
I think to be re-elected 5 times, frankly. And, it's not the big things, it's the small things that really count, that you get someone a better house to live in. It's harder now than it was then, or, the actual practical realities of people's lives, which can become so tortuous and demanding and tragic in many ways. And you don't always get the positive result that you hope for, but at least you get your letter answered or your phone call returned or things like that by virtue of being in Westminster, and that was often something that your constituents had never experienced. No one ever answered their letters or answered their phones, even though the problems within their lives were real and permanent.
And I'm sure there was a sense of so much at stake, and you had a responsibility for people's lives, so there was a greater sense of purpose. But all of that time, what was it, 23 years,
yeah.
Wasn't it? How much privately in those, the wee small hours of the night, did you think, I wish I was back on stage, I really miss making that film? Was there any yearning for it?
Never. Mostly because, what you were dealing with every day was so immediate, so intense, so human, that, there was no way that you would walk away from it. Well, no way that I could walk away from it.
And then, of course, there was the astonishing return, which, and I think it was unexpected, but hugely welcome. And you played King Lear in the West End and in New York in 2017, and won a Tony for Three Tall Women, also on Broadway.
Yeah.
When you first went back on stage, or maybe even in a rehearsal room, was it like muscle memory? Was it like riding a bike? You just got straight back into it, or did you have to sort of start exercising?
I used to get up every morning at 6 o'clock and walk to my local swimming pool, even before we started rehearsing Lear. I'd done a return on the radio. That was been very interesting. Because I felt that I physically wasn't up to doing the play. But it was so, what's the word I'm looking for here? I didn't think I was stepping back into shoes that I'd bought, if you know what I mean. It was something that I really had to do again in a different way because I'd been away from it for so long.
Did you feel like a different actor when you were back on stage?
I don't ever think of myself on stage as an actor. I try to think of myself as the character, but the thing that most amazed me which was a combination of what I was doing, the director, one thing and another, was that the majority of the cast, and it was quite a large cast, were very young. And many of them had worked, having left drama school, very actively. They'd been employed a lot. None of them had ever been on a stage in their lives before.
Wow. Yeah.
None of them had worked in a theatre. And so that was extraordinary, walking into the Old Vic and all these kids going, what? I have to be heard right the way, what? The back row there. And that in itself was just so extraordinary.
Amazing.
I didn't have any problems with that.
Yeah. And it wasn't just stage, of course, there was the television, incredible performance in a couple of years ago. It was 2019, wasn't it? Elizabeth is Missing.
Oh, yeah.
In which Glenda played a woman struggling with dementia,
Mm-hmm.
for which I think you won a BAFTA and an Emmy. And what was the biggest challenge for you in taking on that role, do you think?
Oh, that's very interesting. What was the biggest? Believing in the illness, actually. That, the character that I play, Elizabeth, is in that stage of dementia where she can have time which is completely normal and then time where she doesn't know who she is or where she is or what's going on. And so that kind of in and outish thing was something that I found most interesting and as part and parcel of the actual story that we were telling, and scary, yeah.
Was it important that the play was raising important issues about the treatment of and the way that we regard and the way that we look after people with dementia?
I don't think it had that dimension to it. I mean, it had that quality because it'd been written by this very, very good and young writer, and it was her direct experience of her grandmother. And that kind of first-hand experience in that situation, you know, is something that you can't just brush to one side and say, oh, can't we do it another way? I mean, there it is, it's absolute. And that was so revealing, yeah.
Let's see a clip now from Elizabeth is Missing.
Oh, silly, you'll freeze.
Oh. How did that happen? Eh?
Doesn't matter, Mum.
It does to me. You're my daughter. If you're hurt, it matters to me. I love you very much. Oh. Whoops. Oh. Oh. Hello. Are you waiting for the bus? I don't know when it's going to come. Nothing ever comes. Hope it won't be too long. Oh. Oh. Is it man trouble? Well, don't you worry, he'll be back. Pretty girl like you. I hope I wasn't being too nosy.
Come on, Mum. Let's go home.
Helen. Helen, I didn't know you. I didn't know my own daughter, Helen.
It's all right. It doesn't matter, Mum.
I think it is an astonishing thing to have been away from the stage and the screen for so long and come back and just deliver performances like that are so powerful. And it's the commitment. I think there's a sort of a sense of commitment to each role that we get from you.
I was very lucky. I mean, the actual script, I mean, who's going to turn their nose up at King Lear or, you know, Three Tall Women or Elizabeth is Missing? No one in their right mind would. And it was... I think it's that. I mean, it's the work that's the driving force. And, you know, I mean, it was just amazing to be able to do it, to have the opportunity to do it. And with people who worked, you know, for the work and not for something else.
We saw you right at the beginning of this evening, at the start of your career in the 60s, a young woman. Now here we are playing older women. What I mean, in your own life, what do you like about getting older?
Nothing. Nothing. I mean, my hands shake. I drop things. I just find it irritating. I mean, I don't think really it's age. It's a combination of what we've all experienced, the COVID lockdown, you know, and the lack of work. I mean, work that you're going to do and it's always cancelled and one thing and another. And, you know, I was raised in a family where if you didn't work, you didn't eat. It was very simple. And that sticks with you all your life. And that sense of not working, I don't mean, because I managed to keep my flat clean, but what I mean is that kind of work aspect, not to have it, is it's irritating, if not more. Yeah.
But there is more work, isn't there? You're not giving up. There is no sense of retirement at all.
No, there isn't. But there is I think, a real lack of the kind of association between what people see on stage, for instance, by sitting in an audience, and what people do now, which is all look at that thing in their hand, isn't it, or something? I mean, you're talking to someone who doesn't have any of that stuff, so I wouldn't know quite what to call it, but...
You're talking about a mobile phone which connects you to the internet.
Well, I'm talking about everything coming through a machine in a way, as opposed to through a direct human exchange, be it good, bad, or indifferent. You know, there is something there that is not in the created for a camera. I don't approach work like that. I don't have favourite performances. I mean, I object strongly to people talking about the opening night of something, you know, and the first performance. Every performance on the stage is the opening night and the first performance, however long you're in it and however long it runs. So I can't really answer that question. And I go back to what I said earlier. I'm always amazed still that I'm offered work, and I always think when I finish it, that will be the last. I would say they're pretty equivalent in both being an actress and being an MP, if you're a woman. I mean, it's still there. It's got better, I think, in Parliament because there are more women now, but it's still, you can almost taste it. I mean, the kind of dismissive approach there is to women's questions, women's arguments, things like that. And it's still that way in the theatre, certainly, and obviously in the other, you know, films, television. It was almost a kind of token that by the certain directors and certain writers, that age of cinema, because they still, the women were not the major drivers of the drama. No. I mean, 9 times out of 10 were victims in some way. But certainly there was a broadening of the, what's the word, the kind of social class system than we'd had ever before. I mean, you were actually seeing working class people who did more than scrub floors and things like that. You know, they actually had beliefs and ideas and ideals. But there was still that gender imbalance, as there is today. Well, none of those things, actually. I mean, no, I mean, the driving force, having actually gone into wanting to be an actress, was getting a job. I mean, you know, getting a job was amazing. And they could be good or they could be bad as characters are concerned. But to actually have a job meant that you could eat. But the real transformative work for the whole of my acting life was working with Peter Brook, who just transformed my whole view of what the theatre was, could be, should be, might be, and engaged everybody in the pursuit of that when you worked with him. And, you know, it's hard to come to realise that even though he was 97, which is a good long life, he's dead.
But that was working with Peter Brook, that's when you were already sort of foot on the ladder and starting that climb. But I think the question... No, I wasn't. I mean, I first worked with him when he was still with the RSC. Right. And, you know, the Theatre of Cruelty, which was the first thing that he did, which was staged for an audience, came out of the blue. I mean, it was completely innovative. But who were the role models growing up, maybe watching television or going to the theatre? Was there any particular actor that you looked at and thought, that's what I want to be like?
No, because I didn't have a television. We didn't have a telly. Most of the cinema was American. Again, people like Joan Crawford and Betty Davis. I mean, you know, just astonishing that I actually got letters from Joan Davis when I... Joan Crawford when I got the Women's Award, you know, the Oscars, and great. I actually met Betty Davis and actually, you know, had dinner with her and things like that. That was extraordinary. But no. I don't think I've been inside a theatre in about 30 years, other than to work in one.
30?
At least. at least. I mean, I never went when I was in Parliament, you know what I mean?
Right.
Because you work every night. And I have to say, television now, and I mean, it all seems to be very old television that has come back. I mean, I presume that that's post-COVID and things. And I haven't been in a cinema, I don't think, for a very long time. But again, that's kind of what my work was, you know. And then when I came back to this country, I mean, we hit COVID, and so you didn't go out. I'm more of a radio person, actually.
Good choice.
Thank you.
But I presume, Glenda, that you do have a television now.
Oh, yeah.
Your flat.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh,
you don't do the box sets, you don't do those
No.
kind of big series, you don't get stuck in.
No, I mean, I can just about handle the numbers. But fortunately, you know, my family's upstairs, so if there's something I desperately want to see, they will come and save me.
Fantastic.
Well, I think Blackheath has stayed pretty much physically the same as it was when I first went there, which was in the 60s, I think. But what one is watching now is the huge improvement in main streets, even though we're told that people don't go to shops anymore. I think they still do. And I think that's partly because of the Olympics, which certainly were transformative as far as Southeast London was concerned. And that still has repercussions. But how much that will have drifted backwards because of the COVID lockdown, we'll have to wait and see. I mean, it's not very cheerful at the moment, but, you know, improvements have been made. Well, it was great. I mean, Georgina is here tonight. I mean, you know, just two women. And the play itself is such a wonderful mixture of horror because it was during the Second World War, and humour. And it was a wonderful way of kind of criticising, and yet there were elements that the women were still there in the play, and their male, you know, loves were always, in a sense, breathing down their necks, and but it was great to do.
Interesting, you mentioned earlier playing in Mary, Queen of Scots when you were playing Elizabeth there. That was a kind of a villainous take on, and obviously Ava Braun as well. The villainous roles. Would you ever have played Thatcher if you'd been asked to?
It would be very dependent on who wrote it, I think. And I mean that seriously. But I can't imagine playing her as a heroine, no. Oh, I like to be surprised a lot, so it's not so much that I wish I knew. I don't believe that it's any easier now for women in the areas you've talked about than it was when I began. And so the idea that there is some path that is already there and all you need is advice on how to walk down it is simply not true. I mean, the hardest thing is to get a job and then to get another job. And, you know, I was very lucky. I amend that, I am very lucky. But it's going to be tough. And don't let anybody tell you it isn't. Sorry to be such a...
But Gen Z think you're cool and funny, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, but it's not me.
No, you are cool and funny.
Oh, well, okay. The battle, the kind of gender battle had been being fought in this country by actresses for quite some time. And I think, in essence, that was won by that group of women. And now it's less of a thing for a woman to play a man's role in one of the classics than it was when they started. I still think it's a long way to go. But if that is a way of enlarging our realization as audiences, and also I'm speaking as a performer here, of the real depths and variety that there are at the moment. It's mostly classic plays that women are allowed to appear in that sense. I think that would be a step forward in hopefully bringing forward the contemporary female dramatists who are still, I think, patronized, essentially. I mean, the big thing is that they're women, not that they're dramatists. Do you know what I mean? I don't understand that at all.
I know there's so many questions here that people want to ask you. I'm really aware that we're running up against the clock, and we're just going to wrap up, but we're going to finish by seeing what I think many people, maybe even yourself, regard as one of your finest ever screen performances, alongside two absolute giants of the small screen. Here you are, playing Cleopatra.
Hey, what?
Don't let him frighten you.
Yes, but if he tells Julius Caesar about you and I, you know, with the yellow folks, and what about the workers? I'll lose me pension and me gold watch.
All men are fools, and what makes them so is having beauty like what I have got.
You have a plan?
Leave me alone. Leave me alone with him for 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
5 minutes. Him, and then we need fear nothing he may do.
Please! He is a soldier of Rome. It is impossible to incriminate him.
Leave me alone with him.
Just as you say, Cliff. What do you think of it so far? Rubbish!
All I have to say is thank you so much to the cool and funny Glenda Jackson.
Oh, thank you.